What's up YouTube? You've read the title. This is indeed my first impressions review of the Fuji X-T4, which is a camera that has already been out on the market for at least 1.5 years. So you might say that I'm slightly late to the party, but I've seen a lot of reviews and even long-term reviews of this camera, and for me personally there were a lot of aspects left out of those reviews that were particularly interesting to me, so I'm trying to cover these aspects. And if you are still on the verge of buying this camera or maybe upgrading to something else, this video might also be interesting to you. So let's get into it. So the X-T4, it's a strange one, that's for sure. To give you an idea of where I'm coming from, I have been a Canon DSLR shooter for a number of years, but I switched to the Fuji X-T30 back in 2019. That is the camera I shot like 95% of the footage for my YouTube videos on, as well as a ton of stills and personal projects. Despite some obvious limitations and drawbacks, the X-T30 was the perfect camera for me at the time when I bought it, at least when keeping the price in mind. It was over 900 euros back when I bought it, and I simply wasn't ready to spend more than $1,000 on an APS-C camera, and since I was still working on my second law degree back then, I was also not in a place financially speaking to go full frame altogether. And oh well, I mean, it worked. It is a great camera in its own right. And I still haven't fully made up my mind on whether I want to keep it as a B cam or sell it. It offers 8-bit 4K videos at 30 FPS and slow motion in 1080 all the way up to 120 FPS. It has a tilt screen, looks and feels fantastic, and is overall just a joy to use. But at the end of the day, it is most certainly still a consumer camera with some enthusiast features built in, and it is not a professional tool, and that is fine by me. I'm not a professional, I am an enthusiast, but lately I've gotten to a point where I felt like the camera was holding me back more and more, and it was getting harder and harder to work around those issues. The X-T4 now does use the same sensor as the X-T30, but unlike the X-T30, it is a full-blown enthusiast camera that can surely also be used for professional applications. I still think it's more of an enthusiast tool and not a straight-up professional camera, mostly because of its dials, but again, I have no doubt that it won't disappoint when being used in a professional environment. With that out of the way, I guess it is time to answer why I decided to just buy the X-T4 and not upgrade to full frame altogether and go with something like the Sony a7C, or maybe even go all in and upgrade to something like the Sony a7S III or the Canon R5. These cameras are great, I'm sure about that, and I'm also sure that they would best the X-T4 in just about every way, but they are professional tools for professional users and they are quite expensive. So to be perfectly honest, buying an R5 or an a7S III really was never on the table for me. The people who buy those cameras are either filthy rich, or they can treat those cameras as business investments and can rely on making the money they spent on the camera back again and then some with their business. That is not me, however. While I do make some money with this humble YouTube channel, it is by far not enough to justify a purchase like a Sony a7S III or similar cameras, not to forget the lenses that you need to go along with the camera. And therefore, going full frame and buying one of those high-end flagship cameras really wouldn't have made any sense for me from a financial standpoint. And also on a side note, while I think, as I said before, that those cameras will best the X-T4 in just about every way, I'm not quite convinced that the difference would be that noticeable for me and for my applications. So yeah, with professional full-frame cameras out of the way, there were really only options like the Sony a7C that might have been interesting, but the Sony a7C in particular is after all still a consumer camera, even though it utilizes a full-frame sensor. So after all, my issue was the following. I wanted to upgrade from the X-T30 because I wanted to get out of the consumer market and get some more professional features like 10-bit and 60 frames per second in 4K, weather resistance, dual card slots, fast burst modes for stills, a good button and dial layout that isn't dumbed down, a good EVF, and so on. The A7C, while it is, I'm sure, a great camera in its own right, doesn't offer as many professional features as the X-T4 does. So to be honest, the only reason why I would have gotten the Sony a7SC instead of the X-T4 would have been to use it as a gateway to get into the Sony full-frame system, buy those lenses, and then upgrade to a more professional camera later on. So in conclusion, I would have bought the camera that I wouldn't be satisfied with from the get-go, just in order to spend more money on the camera system later on. Also, lastly, another big reason for me to stay within the Fuji ecosystem is that I honestly really just enjoy their cameras. I've already bought a variety of lenses for the Fuji system over the years, and I've really gotten used to how these cameras operate. As I said, I currently not only own the X-T4, but also still the X-T30 and the X100V. I just love how Fuji's cameras look and feel. They are obviously made for a more retro, throwback, hipster vibe, which is not to everybody's taste, but I enjoy it a ton. Also, having those aesthetics and the usability that comes along with having all those haptic dials doesn't ever come with any drawbacks on Fuji's cameras. And yeah, those are the reasons why I decided to stay within the Fuji ecosystem and just upgrade to the flagship, which is currently the Fuji X-T4. So just to go back for a minute, the things that were most frustrating to me about the Fuji X-T30 were the following. I was limited to 4K at 30 FPS and could only shoot that for 10 minutes at a time. There was no flip screen, so the only way I could see myself was by using a big HDMI screen, which kind of negates the point of having such a compact camera. It doesn't use a regular aux port for microphones, so I always had to use adapters. The battery life was poor, I couldn't get to the SD card slot or the battery when I had a tripod plate mounted to the camera, even when I used it with an added grip. The camera wasn't officially rated as water resistant, so taking it out in the rain always felt like rolling the dice on my investment. And, maybe most importantly, it didn't have IBIS. Since APS-C cameras by their nature have small sensors compared to full frame cameras, they don't perform as well in high ISO situations, and over ISO 3200 the footage tends to get really rough. So in order to keep the ISO at a lower number, you can pretty much only lower the shutter speed, which in video is only possible to a certain point before you get choppy footage, or you can open up your aperture. But since those prime lenses with big beautiful 1.4 apertures are not stabilized, they are not really an option for handheld video. You can always use a tripod, but that slows down the process and means you have to bring that tripod everywhere. Also, walking and handheld shots are completely out of the picture unless you are willing to also bring a gimbal as well. You can of course just ignore those shakes or try to stabilize the footage in post, but that's not what I want to do. So while the image sensor is the same on both cameras here and there's not much of a difference in terms of ISO performance, the X-T4 truly opened up so many possibilities to me when it comes to shooting video in low light, just because it enabled me to use my prime lenses when shooting handheld. All of the shots you see here were taken handheld on either the Fuji 16mm f1.4 or the Viltrox 56mm f1.4. In my experience, the IBIS works great on the X-T4. At least as long as you're aiming the camera steadily at one point. It can get a bit twitchy when you walk, pan or move the camera, but in my experience it still works in those use cases most of the time, and the slight jerkiness you might get doesn't really concern me. The same is true for stills by the way, but since I only had this camera for roughly 3 weeks, and sadly I didn't have many opportunities to go out and take photos during that time. But even from the few test shots that I've taken, I know that handheld shots at 1/8 of a second look as clean as they can be. The IBIS works even beyond that, but in my experience there's just too much movement within most frames from leaves, people, cars and so on that would cause noticeable blur for me to go any lower than that. It would also rarely ever be necessary, since most of the shots that I've taken with this camera at f1.4 and 1/8 of a second were also taken at ISO 160, so I got headroom for days. Another improvement that I really enjoy is the battery performance. I already bought 2 spare batteries from a third-party manufacturer and this sweet USB-C dual charger from Nightcore, which allows for quick and compact on-the-go recharging of my batteries. I also enjoy the flip screen, at least when I'm trying to film myself like I am now, but honestly in all other situations I would prefer to have the old tilt screen of yesteryear. But oh well, can't have it all I guess. Having side access to the SD card slots is also nice, because it allows me to take out the SD card without unscrewing a tripod mount. The camera is also rated as weather resistant, which should come in handy in the rapidly approaching fall and winter seasons. Besides that, there are also some minor upgrades that I truly enjoy, like this quick switch to toggle between photo and video mode, or the push lock buttons that keep the ISO and shutter speed wheel locked in place. While I enjoy those styles a lot for photography, I prefer to have the ISO and shutter speed mapped to my index finger and thumb when shooting video, which the camera offers by default when movie optimized controls are enabled. There's also now an F-Log view assist mode, which basically shows your F-Log footage with a Rec. 709 LUT in real time while recording. and that makes exposing an f-log a lot easier. On another note, if you've seen any of my other videos about bags and backpacks, you know that I do like my following shots, which I generally slow down to give them a smoother look. So having the ability to do that in 4K now with 60 FPS is a nice addition as well. Oh, and 10-bit colors. Truth be told, I'm not the greatest at color editing. In fact, I'm still very much just trying to get a grip on the whole subject. But even with my limited experience, it seems like I'm able to attain a more pleasing look a lot easier with 10-bit colors, especially when filming an f-log. I will keep it at that for now, but let's just say that 10-bit color was one of the great reasons for me to make the jump to the X-T4. Shooting 8-bit f-log made color grading a nightmare, since so much color information gets lost in the process, which led to me not really enjoying using f-log on the X-T30 overall, even though that is the only way to truly unlock the dynamic range potential of the sensor on these cameras. Oh, and talking about dynamic range, again, technically speaking, it's probably not much better on the X-T4 than it is on the X-T30, since I use the same sensor. But because you can shoot f-log in 10-bit now, it really is a much more enjoyable and usable experience overall. The dynamic range this camera offers is great in my opinion, and I would be surprised if there even was a night and day difference between this and cameras like the A7S III. But anyway, overall my experience using the X-T4 has been great so far. Sure, it has been out on the market for at least 1.5 years, but in between chip shortages and supply chain issues, I think there are still people out there who are toying with the idea of upgrading to the Fuji X-T4. So if you find yourself in a similar situation to the one that I just described to you, I would say just go for it, you won't regret it. I honestly didn't expect the Fuji X-T4 to feel like such a different camera compared to the X-T30, and to be really honest, I kind of expected to be a bit underwhelmed by the X-T4 and feel like I just wasted 1800 bucks on it, but no, not at all. It costs twice as much as the X-T30, but it also feels like at least twice the camera. With all of its features, it is on a completely different level. It is a truly great camera and arguably even the best camera that the APS-C world has to offer right now. But anyway, that's it for today's first impressions review. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and until next time, take care.